Okay, I think we can get going here. This is a very informal panel. We haven't had any prep work, and even the topic has been fluctuating a bit. Originally, I imagined it was going to be about open source AI, so it'd be a fascinating thing to talk about. I think we can dive into that a little bit. But then some of the topics that have been sort of surfaced early on today kind of stood on top of that, and so I loosely was thinking in my head, this can be the future of AI, sort of a panel. Where do we want it to go? But before we start, let's just introduce every person here. And in particular, I wanted to introduce Gabriele Manzini. So he is the architect and lead author of the EU AI Act. He is an MIT research affiliate and fellow, and so he can add another very fascinating dimension to this discussion, that of regulation and sort of like in a broader policy perspective to this discussion. So he is joined here by Anna, who we just heard from, the creator of Vana, and CEO of Open Data Labs. We have Mark Sermon, president of Mozilla, and then we have Daniel Beutel. He is the co-creator of Flower and the CEO of Flower Labs. And so we now know all of our panelists here, and you can see how there's really a rich mixture of topics that we can sort of explore. We'll take questions from the audience too, so don't be shy. But just to start with, I want to give Gabriele a chance to sort of dive in, because you haven't had opportunity to speak thus far. And so I was wondering if you could maybe tell us where you see AI regulation today. How do you think it's going? And how do you think it relates to some of the themes that have been discussed thus far?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with, and of course also quite complex. Certainly the picture is somewhat easy when it comes to the EU, because we have the EU AI Act. This has been a process I was involved in since the beginning, and it took quite some years, but I would say not too many years considering the complexity of the process. If you compare, for instance, that GDPR, often talked about, and today we are still dealing with the consequences of the GDPR and trying to understand a bit how AI is impacted by GDPR. It took about 4 years to negotiate. And actually GDPR came after the EU already had for about 10 years what was called the Data Protection Directive, which was the precursors of the GDPR. So in fact, we already had in the EU some structures, some thinking around privacy that had informed then the GDPR. And so when it comes to AI, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council concluded negotiations in 3 years, which to my mind was certainly, very fast compared to, the experience of GDPR, because we started from scratch. So I think that's certainly now, stick on the ground. That's and I've been traveling a bit around the world, and everywhere people are just want to understand more. What's the AI Act? What's the impact? They just want to know, because governments around the world are facing the same questions. But I see somehow a sort of a lot of doubts around it. So there are jurisdictions where they just simply copy-paste. This happens, for instance, in Brazil or in certain countries in the US, although none of these jurisdictions is actually finalized. But then there are also pushbacks in those same countries where, are we sure we want to copy-paste? And in other jurisdictions, then there's completely different approaches. Like, for instance, recently Japan, actually they really didn't really look into that as a model, I would say. But certainly it's a topic of discussion, which deserves to be discussed, and I think that's probably the merit of the EU AI Act, to have really force a conversation about what does it mean to have trustworthy AI, how do we want AI to be in the next 5, 10, 12 years, 15 years, 20 years. But then when it comes to actually the impact, I think a lot of questions are still open.
And not to put you on the spot, but there's some interesting themes emerging that we've been discussing so far. I imagine there might be sort of newer sort of themes for what you've seen. People talking about decentralized, people talking about how users can kind of grab their data and train on it. What do you think about these ideas from a policy and regulatory perspective? I imagine they might one might imagine that they might make things more complicated, but perhaps you see how they might simplify other things. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in sort of decentralized AI. Of course, I'm a lawyer as a background. I definitely see there are lots of benefits in that. I mean, first of all, the fact that you actually can have these models being run more decentralized manner. So in a way, there's more control on the data for the inference, for the training. I mean, that's certainly something that only goes in the direction of more privacy. So, and certainly this is a topic that I think everyone agrees on. That makes a lot of sense. When I think about, indeed, also decentralized AI also means that actually you don't necessarily have access to the data, right? And that, for instance, thinking about the AI Act, there is a provision there that says that, for instance, authorities may need to have access to the data. So which means that, in a way, on the one hand, decentralized AI allows training of models without necessarily centralizing all the data sets, but you still may have to secure somehow the access or make sure that you do have an access at a later point if that is needed to demonstrate that the model is in conformity with the law. Sure. So I think these things will keep coming back and forth, in my view, that you have, as new technology comes in, maybe certain provisions may become, some of them will be better enforced, and other probably will become more of an obstacle in some sense.
I see. And perhaps opening up to the rest of you, I mean, one question would be, each of you have a sort of, I think, an idea of what you want AI to become. Do you want to perhaps outline where you might want to see AI go? And then if there's anything from a policy or regulatory, what would be one thing you'd like to see change in that space that could help accelerate where you want AI to go? And maybe starting with Daniel.
Sure, I'm happy to take this. So from a regulatory standpoint, I think when I look at this, I always look at it from two perspectives. On the one hand, as an individual living in the EU, there's obviously I'm happy about the rights that GDPR, for example, grants me, and I think many of the ideas are very good and are deserve to be supported. As a founder, there's also you can also some of the regulatory frameworks they also pose some challenges. Some of those challenges are actually good that they're posed, but then there's also some challenges that just that just don't make sense. It just increased bureaucracy quite a bit. You have to do more paperwork, and you would ideally, it doesn't help anyone really. What I find the most interesting, I think, and that's I think the part where also we all as a community interested in decentralized AI can come together and can support that, is I feel like a lot of the political discussions, not all of them, but many of the political discussions are very dominated by that old assumption that in order to do AI, you need to centralize all the data. And then some of the regulatory proposals and some of the public funding initiatives and a lot of these things, they actually start from this misunderstanding that, in order to train a model, you just have to have access to the data, which is just not true anymore. So I think this is a challenge for all of us as a community to just talk more about this and actually convince the necessary stakeholders, not just convince, but just educate, basically, and show them that you can build incredible AI systems, state-of-the-art AI systems, as we've seen today, without having access to the raw training data.
Yeah, I think from a data rights perspective, giving users more and more kind of guarantees around being able to easily access their data, right? So for example, being able to have a user get API access from their data. Right now, it can be kind of a cumbersome process to go and export it. I think it is really important that there's kind of a good dialogue between AI researchers and policymakers because the technology is moving so quickly, right? The way we train AI models 4 years ago is completely different from how we train them today, which is very different from how we'll train them in 2 years. So I think just keeping that open dialogue is important. Maybe one thing I'd mention on the privacy side is that I think the user perspective of privacy, I've seen it shift a lot recently, where it's gone from this maybe ideological or preference question of I don't want my data out there to much more of an economic question of like my job is at risk if somebody takes the data I've produced and trains an AI model to then do that work. And so I think that's really raised the stakes, and there are sort of policy implications of that as well.
So many things in this, and what an interesting group. I mean, I guess maybe I'll pick up on that. It wasn't the same 4 years ago, it's then now, and then 2 years and 10 years. And I think that's such a challenge because 3 years is fast. And I mean, I'm a fan of the EU AI Act. We've got to kind of work out the open source questions that got put in at the end. But, other than that, and like things move so fast. And we're trying to figure out how to build this balance between, the public and what society needs and what private actors, need in a fast-moving environment. Somehow there's got to be more adaptivity in the system. And I know that's not yours to solve, but I think really how we think about policymaking and balancing private and public goods is a really big nut to crack right now. And I think if I could wish some things for the GDPR and the EU AI Act or regulation in general in that fast-moving environment, I think you saw in California they added delegation of data rights, which you didn't have in the GDPR. Like being able to have innovations like that, be able to spin back in, because that's I don't know if you guys rely on that in any specific way, but to be able to have, if people don't know it, the Californian Privacy Act lets you say, well, I'm going to actually delegate to Vana or somebody else my data rights, and so that they can manage them on my behalf. And I think looking at speed of regulatory innovation itself is not an academic topic, but a very practical topic. And one kind of hack, open source, of course, is a hack on copyright law. I think one kind of a hack on speed of regulation is to look at public funding and industrial policy and look at the intent in a regulatory environment, very different parts of the government typically, but how do we use public funding and industrial policy to start to play with in a more dynamic way the intent behind regulation. And so if you look at, so the Airbus for AI or CERN for AI, those types of proposals, making those actually draw back to what's the intent in the AI Act, building an economy around the intent in the AI Act, building an economic zone that is adapted to those sets of balances between the public and the private actors. So I think there's something really to look at. How do we much more quickly and creatively use the tools that we have in the public sector, working with people who are building companies that are aligned with those goals? And I think we're not pushing ourselves hard enough on that yet.
Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think also what Daniel said, I think I would agree also that some of the sort of regulator mindsets in developing regulations is really sort of fixing one problem, which is that of sort of big tech problem. That also has its own narrative about more and more data and more compute, and that's how you in the end in the AI Act you got into this like threshold of compute as sort of one of the benchmark to which after DeepSeek doesn't make a lot of sense any longer. Or in a distributed environment. Yes, this I was going to say, but I'm not competent to say. So and that's explains a bit my frustration with that process, because it's kind of felt like that almost the policymaker felt into the trap of a narrative which was clearly from only certain actors, and that's of course a problem for the EU, because we can't just as you say develop an ecosystem around a really trustworthy AI, which is what we want, if we don't give ourselves a chance and we just keep raising the barrier of regulation higher and higher, that ultimately only certain actors can comply with. And so that's in my view a bit the problem that we need to fix going forward. So at that moment, better to have lighter regulations, so at least you have everyone is on the same. You don't set a threshold so high that only certain actors can reach.
I just want to maybe perhaps you raised a DeepSeek. It's sort of an elephant in the room for many of these discussions. So I was curious, how do any of you feel that DeepSeek has changed this type of discussion now? Meaning the future of AI, maybe how regulation evolves and so forth. It's definitely showing that open source AI is going to be more than competitive and perhaps going to be leading moving forward. So there's also this country aspect to it. So I'm just curious if anyone has thoughts on this.
I mean, it's not open source AI. It's an open weights model, and there's open source pieces. But I think so, and we also don't know really what happened. But I think that the narrative piece of it and the technical innovation we can tell, to me, it had two impacts. One is that the orthodoxy that you get from OpenAI and from Silicon Valley about the fact that it can only be centralized and only expensive and only the people with the most money, that was challenged, which opens the opportunity to then challenge what are the other pieces of orthodoxy that they have, which is that it can only be trained by scraping the web. You can't do performant models without stealing copyrighted materials, all of these things. And to me, it's actually opened a really interesting conversation in just a few months, that we don't have to accept the orthodoxy to do state-of-the-art models. And you actually see that here. So when we talk about maybe you guys are the DeepSeek moment for federated learning and DAOs. To be able to show that we can do this stuff a different way, that's actually, to me, the lesson of DeepSeek. And then, there's another part of the orthodoxy that it broke, which is the orthodoxy it can only come from the West Coast of America. And I think that really hopefully opens people's minds in some exciting ways.
I think the one part that you mentioned, I want to double down on that, and I think it's this going from 1 to N, going from just one place where this kind of innovation can happen and these models can be trained, going to N places. Even if N is just equals 2 in that case, but it shows that this is possible also somewhere else, and it's possible with a method that just that doesn't follow the blueprint that came before it. I think that's the exciting part about it. I think there was also quite a bit of noise around the announcement, and I think some of the facts, they got distorted as more and more people start to report on it. So I think there's also quite a few misunderstandings. It still required quite a bit of compute to train these models. So it's not something to downplay too much. But I think what I found interesting is that you can find innovation and great hacks in places where you didn't look before, and suddenly you get much, much better results.
I think one of the interesting things about DeepSeek is it really showed the power of high-quality data, where they started with an extremely high-quality data set that was created by computer science and math PhDs who were just generating these logic data sets. Apparently, their founder was literally helping to generate some of these data sets himself, too. And if you look at the parent company, you can actually see they're hiring people to do this kind of data curation and really high-quality data. And I think it does challenge this assumption where right now we basically just throw a bunch of relatively low quality data at models and hope that if we continue to do that with data and compute, it will eventually create AGI. I feel like that's kind of the approach, but it shows there are actually many other ways to do that, right? And I think that quality is really important from a user perspective because users can contribute really high quality data, right? And rather than kind of going and collecting whatever you can on the public internet, if you have users curate really high quality information, you could use a similar approach to create much better AI.
I think it would be a good time to open up to the audience. There's this question right in the back. I'm just going to run down there and we can see what question we have.
Hi, everyone. I had this question for Anna previously, but I'm happy to pass it out to the panel. It's because of the data right for me is that I have a consent to give you data, but anytime I want, I can have a chance to give it back. How it works in the AI world with the challenging, if you train based on my data, what's the way out then?
Yeah, so when you contribute your data to a data DAO, you are kind of giving them access to be able to make decisions on your data, and then you're taking that ownership of the data set. In some cases, data DAOs can give you the opposite. So you can basically give back that ownership and then have them remove your data. But if they've trained an AI model on your data today, then that AI model would still have learned information from your data. And that's similar to kind of all the situations with all the different big tech companies, right? Where even if you're deleting, I mean, it's actually kind of a case with 23andMe, which I've been talking about recently, where they actually have trained things on that data. And so even if you go delete your data, there's still some derivative of it in there. One of the things that I think could solve this down the line is federated inference. So if you imagine that every user has trained a small portion of the model weights on only their data, then you can kind of use them like Legos, right, and take them in and out. But that is an open research question today.
I think we had a question in the corner there.
Hello, thank you so much for the insightful discussion. My question is to Gabriel. Thanks again for opening with the contrast between GDPR and EU AI Act, which makes it super easy to ask my question, which is, where do these two regulations align? Where do they differ and in a way contradict? I'm particularly referring to Article 35, which talks about data processing for high-risk applications and the risk-based categorization in the EU AI Act. Thank you.
Sorry, could you just repeat?
Where does EU AI Act and the GDPR align?
Oh.
And where do they even contradict?
Yeah, that's a big question. The reality was that when I started working on the AI Act, there was no discussion around touching the GDPR. As you may know, the GDPR is considered to be it's almost as a crown jewel of the EU legislation. And so actually, President von der Leyen, when she announced the AI Act in her speech to the Parliament, she said, well, we have set global standards with the GDPR. We need to do the same with AI. So the approach was very much the same. So there was no question around, okay, we have to now to have specific legislation on AI, which of course, creates certain challenges around different type of challenges around privacy or maybe different also opportunities. So we may want to perhaps address some of those challenges by actually looking just at GDPR. In reality, today, after all the process, I think the AI Act, as I said before, has some merits. But, if you just want to look at the actual practical implications of how to solve certain of the challenges around AI, which is, for instance, fairness, discrimination in decision-making. The GDPR already has quite important tools that can be used. So I see that, potentially we could have even imagined a situation where just leveraging the GDPR and making its enforcement stronger could have already been a good first step in preventing some of the challenges of AI. But the AI Act comes at a stage where, indeed, we we take for granted GDPR, we don't touch it, and we just wanted to add a layer of, let's say, how can I call it, oversight to the actual development of the system that processes personal data. So GDPR applies to the system as well while it processes personal data and to the impact the system may have, to the extent it does an automated decision-making, for instance. But the GDPR does not touch, if you want, the training of the system. And so the AI Act comes at an earlier stage to basically try to impose on developers the way to think about these automated systems in such a way that they actually do not lead to certain risks. Or you try to mitigate the risk ahead of time. But you can tackle the same question either upfront or afterwards by strengthening, if you want, remedies afterwards. But that's why ultimately, from my perspective, also considering the political reality that we couldn't change GDPR, I think it was clear that, okay, we should just leave it as it is, but we limit intervention of the AI Act on a certain specific area and do this quite surgically. So that was the initial intention. But ultimately, things turned out to be quite different. And also, actually, we see today almost overlaps between GDPR and AI Act, which actually, it's not, in my view, really a good thing going forward. But the logic ultimately is very much aligned to really focus, with the exception of the part of general purpose AI models, I would say, to really focus on sort of trying to prevent risk on sensitive areas that impact people's lives, so where you process personal data.
We have a question just in the front, and then we'll go to the back.
Yeah, maybe a very short one. On the data privacy or privacy in general, is the common opinion that TEEs are the solution for basically securing data in use, or because of the trade-off of performance and then privacy or data security?
So in some cases, yes. So if you are just running compute on your own data, then you don't need a TE because it can just be in an environment that you control, right? So if you're familiar with Solid Project or Urbit, they've taken a similar kind of federated approach. But then the question becomes if the four of us all put our data together, we can't use any of our compute environments because we would have to trust each other. So that's where the TE is used. If you have full kind of federated training and federated inference working, where you could go across, each of us trains our full piece and then each of us runs inference across our full pieces, then you wouldn't need that TE. But in terms of what's required to actually build a state-of-the-art model today, you do need to rely on that. And there are pretty good kind of security guarantees around that. There's kind of, SGX and TDX, which are two of the different kinds of TEs. But it is the case where if you had model weights that are worth $5 billion, that's not a good enough security guarantee. But if it's an individual data set, it's quite a good guarantee.
Cool, thank you.
In the back.
Yeah, this is something to do with the cultural relativism of being of data sharing. As you know, being able to share data is culturally relative, right? Some countries are more willing to share their data. Some countries are less willing to share their data. Would you think that would be the difference why most of the AI companies are going towards countries that are less sensitive in sharing data or respecting copyrights than countries like the EU, where we really don't see a lot of AI companies being formed here?
Anyone?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think the current generation of AI systems just requires massive amounts of compute, and that requires massive amounts of resources. So in order to start out in that area, you already need to have some kind of a background. Even if you start out as a startup, you need to have the right, you need to have access to investors who are willing to fund that journey. I think from my experience, I've seen how this works in different countries. As Flower Labs, we went through Y Combinator, so we've experienced the US network firsthand. And I can say that just in terms of just as a startup founder and as looking for investment and a network and things like that, the Silicon Valley ecosystem is unparalleled. And I knew that beforehand, but I didn't know how big the difference between the Silicon Valley network and other areas around the globe are. There's a great startup culture in the UK, in London. There's great startup culture in Berlin. But really, the ecosystem that I've seen in the Bay Area is just unparalleled. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of this movement is happening there.
Anyone else want to weigh in, or we can take one more question? Well, unless Mark, you look very tempted.
I'm torn because I want to say something kind of political. So I mean the wealth flows back to Rome, and so I think that's true. And the ecosystem is there because the money is there, and so the money keeps going there. And so I do think also we have to kind of look at where the money is and what are the things that counterbalance that and get the money in the right places, or fragment where the money is. And I think that is a key piece where, you can start with smaller resources. And there's a cultural piece as well, but I think the kind of things we're talking about now are things that can make smaller things actually grow with less resources to start. So I think that is one piece. But then the other place, I think the data thing is a piece of it, but it is actually also kind of approach and power. China is the other place that has jumped forward, and that's because there's an incredible centralized intent about where to take the economy. And so that's where I think in Canada or in Europe, we actually are too shy to take the centralized intent and say, that's when I talk about industrial policy needing to express what's in the AI Act. Like, we could have a centralized intent around distributed, democratic, technical systems and building an economy with them, and we are wimpy about it. And so I think that's actually part of the piece, is to kind of have the forthrightness, and we have done this in other eras with democracy and to build socialism and social democratic systems. So I think there is a question of forcefulness and political will to build an alternative.
Very interesting. One last question.
Yeah, the topic of economy and money leads into my question perfectly, actually, which is, especially in these user-owned models, you're training them with TEEs, which solves a lot of the trust problems, but how do you solve, TEEs are, at the end of the day, they're still computers, still hooked up to the power grid, still consuming resources that come out of someone's wallet, right? Who's that wallet when you're talking about such a decentralized governance framework, right? Because when we're talking, this is a problem that's not new in FL. It comes up a lot in cross-silo, for example, where you're having to coordinate institutions who are pulling resources together, and you devise governance frameworks for that. How do you apply that to somewhere like DAOs, where you don't have such a clear owner, right? Who owns the DAO? It's already a collective system, so who's actually funding it in this scenario?
Yeah, so in the same way that Bitcoin and Ethereum, who's funding an Ethereum node, it works the same way for Vana, actually. So it's all managed by the network. So you can run a TE and then you earn based on the kind of compute that you're providing. Right now, that list of TEs is kind of whitelisted for security reasons, but it is a distributed network of people actually running this. And you have some redundancies where if one of them drops off, you can have it in another TE instead. But I do think that is one of the centralization points, right? Where at the end of the day, wherever those model weights are, you can pull the plug, right? And so you kind of have to think about, when you're designing this resilient system, both where can the compute run on the unencrypted data, and then also where do you store the encrypted data? And Vana is storage agnostic, actually. So there are a bunch of different storage providers. You can use IPFS, which is decentralized storage. You can also, as a DAO, opt to use a centralized storage option or use both. Or you can have the individuals all store data on their own storage accounts, but then you run into issues if they don't have kind of availability of their data.
And I just want to add one thing. In the same question sometimes comes up with local AI. So I think in the end, it all comes down whether you provide something valuable to the user or not. We've seen this transition with the rise of personal computing and the internet, and the same question applies. Why would I spend money on a computer? And why would I plug it in at home and pay for electricity? But if you build something that actually is better for the user, gives the user more value in whatever way that is, I think users will adopt it, and they will love to adopt it.
Okay, so with that, thank you very much, panelists. It's been a fantastic panel.